Looking for a guaranteed way to create content that resonates with your audience? Start a podcast, interview your ideal clients, and let them choose the topic of the interview. Because if your ideal clients care about the topic, there's a good chance the rest of your audience will care about it too. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Welcome back to the B2B Growth Show. We're here today with Brett Trainor. He is a principal in the Industries Group focused on B2B growth. Brett, how are you doing today, man?
Hey, great, Logan. It's great to be here. Been a fan of the show for a while, so it's nice to be a guest on the show.
Hey, that's great to hear. I was a longtime listener of the show before I became a Sweetfish employee and a co-host of the show. So we share that in common, man. Well, it is always great to connect with listeners. And when you started telling me a little bit about your background and where you're going with this framework that you're sharing with folks, I knew that it was going to make for great content for our audience. And you, having been a longtime listener, obviously know what makes for good content. So I'm excited to dive in. Before we do that, Brett, let people know what you and your team are up to these days. I think that'd be a great place to start the conversation.
Yeah, sounds good. I'm currently a principal in our Industries Group at PointB. We're a management consulting firm, a lot of the traditional business process, org effectiveness, but I'm heading up our B2B practice. So my focus is exclusively on really helping B2B companies of any size on growth, right? That could be a startup to mid-market all the way up to a Fortune 500 that's got a $3 billion global division. So keeps me busy, keeps me active, and definitely out of trouble.
That last part's probably the most important, right?
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, Brett, we are going to be talking about this 4-part methodology, the ISET methodology, a framework for scalable growth. Before we get into, what the acronym is and breaking down those 4 parts, I'd love for you to share a little bit of what you and I discussed offline, in what led you to this, what led you thinking through this framework and really spending some time to develop it. Tell us a little bit about the background there.
Yeah, sure, you bet. I think, I hate to admit it, but it's now been 25 plus years that I've actually been in the B2B space. The majority of it was on the corporate side, right? So maybe a unique perspective. I've actually run sales teams, demand generation teams, sales ops teams, client services, account management, when they used to call it account management. So I was able to get a pretty unique perspective on kind of what was happening in the industry. Then eventually transitioned into the consulting world when I found, my attention span was better on fixing, shorter term problems than, longer term at the same organization. And spent a little bit of time, about a year, working exclusively with SaaS companies, high growth SaaS companies, which kind of opened my eyes to, a kind of a different model, right? If you think of the traditional, B2B and call it mature company, right? It was the sales process, marketing process, everything was kind of siloed and organized within the different teams. Well, SaaS kind of changed that. So that actually transitioned me into more of a consulting world where I work with, multiple companies, like I said, across the spectrum. And one of the interesting things I found was, kind of the reoccurring challenge I was hearing was we're not growing anymore. A lot of companies do struggle with growth. Everybody wants to grow more. But this was interesting because, I'm talking to, $100 million manufacturer in the Midwest. It's enjoyed double-digit growth for, 12 straight years. But in the last 2 years, not doing anything different, ended up, flat or declining growth rates. And that was becoming a kind of a reoccurring theme. which when you dug deeper and started to dive into some of the research, I believe the root cause of a lot of this is these companies are either no longer aligned with their customers, or maybe they were in an industry where they didn't have to be, that they would still, the customers would buy, the way you wanted them to buy versus the way they want to buy. And I'm starting to see that shift where the buyer is taking more control and wants more control of that process.
Yeah. Yeah. And I remember you talking about that a little bit, like, everybody wants to grow, but, you were seeing this recurring trend of plateaued after, years of continual growth. So I think that, there are definitely some large, as you put it, mature B2B companies that are dealing with this, maybe some SaaS companies that have reached a point of growth that they're maybe starting to experience this. So I'm excited to jump in and kind of unpack each of these. And with the ISET methodology, it's ISET. And this is your framework that you're sharing on scalable growth so that it continues to scale, over time. And it starts with the I of insight. Tell us about that.
Sure. And I'd also add to that I would highly recommend, these should be sequential. There's some things you could do in parallel, but I think as we go through this, you'll understand why it would make sense to start with,
so
insights.
Step number one. Yeah,
exactly. And so insights, this is really all around the customer insights and intelligence, right? The more you can learn about your customer, their buying preferences, what content they're consuming, their journey. And I think the journey part's important to understand both online and offline, right? So if you think about the traditional B2B go-to-market, it's very, linear, right? Where customers now, I want information on demand, I want to do the research offline. So the more that you can understand up front, the better you can design not only your messaging, but, your engagement model, which we'll get to in a little bit, to allow or focus on, that customer preference. So some of the areas that I recommend is really win-loss analysis. So if you've been around for a while, you really understand why your customers are buying from you, and more importantly, why you're losing, right? What is it? Is it a messaging? Is it features and benefits? I mean, this is gold for organizations. And I'd also encourage you not to stop there. Look at the, interview for customer experience analysis, right? So they can talk about the process. And, I'd recommend looking at somebody that just completed that journey with you, that's now a customer, and maybe somebody who was 2 years ago, to provide that feedback. Obviously, the larger the company, the larger the sample size you'd like to get. But this is really where you can build the foundation, base of your company, or at least your go-to-market model.
And it becomes more than just who is our customer, what is the demographic, who's typically buying. Like you said, it's about the wins and the losses. It's about the analyzing and gaining insights into the entire customer experience, right, Brett?
That's exactly right. And like you said, the more, it used to be a marketing thing, or at least you hear it more predominantly marketing, the customer journey mapping and buyer personas. But I think, as these buyers get more sophisticated and expect personalization, the entire organization, I think, needs to align around, some of these principles.
Yeah. So as you've been working with some organizations that are trying to figure out more in this area of customer insights, what are you seeing in what some organizations are doing to successfully kind of organize around that? Like, who owns this, customer insights portion? Is it sales? Is it marketing? Is it, marketing gathering up other departments? What do you see as kind of a practical way to approach gaining these insights?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because I think that's one of the areas organizations struggle with. I mean, I think the natural home you would think would be marketing, where they are looking, especially around the demand generation, maybe some of the branding practices. But I think it's important for product, sales across the board. And I'm starting to see, I don't want to call it a trend yet, but starting to see more organizations creating a standalone customer insights team, right? So anything from churn analysis to the one loss experience, anything that's really an impact to the customer would be owned by this team. Now, obviously, if you're a 3-person founder-led startup, you're not going to have, the resources for that. But it's just one of those. I think when demand generation roles started popping up, it was a hole within the organization. So there's new positions that were created for it. I mean, eventually I would see this as, one of the most, me personally believe this is one of the most important areas to continually understand what your customer is doing, that, this becomes a priority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe a new version of the CIO, Customer Insights Officer, eventually, right?
Exactly. And I think too, one of the other challenges that we work through is, where do you house all the data, right? Is it sitting to your CRM? It's not really geared for that type of data. And if you're getting net promoter scores back, and so it's really starting to, obviously centralizing that information becomes important, then everybody has access to it.
Yeah. Nice. All right. So that's insights. Step number 2 in the process would be story, and focusing on your story. Tell us a little bit about how people are effectively doing that within this framework, Brett.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to the story and the company story, right? So if you think about it, you almost want to drill this down to the product and vertical level. And what I mean by the story, probably in the simplest form, is what problems, and this is kind of a value-based approach, but what problems are you solving for your customers? How do you solve them? How do you do it differently and hopefully better? And do you have the proof points to support, the story that you're telling? And why I'll go back to why we should do this sequentially is if your insights are telling you one thing, but your story is saying something else, you've already got a disconnect within, the organization. And, as people start to look at, that story. And I think the key to this too is a lot of times people think the story is just between sales and marketing, right? Getting that prospect to understand, but it really starts and goes all the way through the org, because what's going to happen is if you're telling that different story once you're on board and become a customer, you're starting to look at renewal process and, extensions of contracts that, you want this to be as seamless as possible for the customer. So they know exactly who you are, what you stand for, and basically how you deliver, your either products or services.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, you make a really good point about proof points. People are looking for social proof more now than ever, as opposed to just, I'm going to believe this brand story because, right? So if we move from there, from the story point, the next step in the framework is engagement. And I know you have some interesting things to share on, how to effectively carry this out. Once you've got insights, you've honed your story to match with those insights, how you go about engagement within this methodology.
Yeah, and this really gets into your various, customer touch points, right? Whether it's online or offline, peer reviews, becoming a bigger and bigger data point within, this space, and not relying on customer testimonials. And this is really designing your go-to-market model around your business model, essentially, right? And I think the example I like to use is working with, almost $1 billion distributor company, and 95% of their revenue is reoccurring, but yet 50% of their assets basically in field-based sales, right? So if you've already got a customer hooked, maybe take a step back and look at where should I be, allocating my resources, right? So if I'm a SaaS model and I'm getting really good inbound traffic, I'm going to have a strong, lead qualification team, somebody that can demo product over the phone. Where if it's a much more complex sale, you're still probably going to be looking at an outside sales team, but how do you support that with other resources to potentially drive down the cost of that sale? Right. I think for too long, companies have said, well, I need a marketing team, I need a sales team, I need a onboarding team and a post sale. Instead of taking a step back, looking at how your customers want to buy from you, and making sure, and when I say assets, it's going to be the people and the technology, right? So what processes can you automate along those lines?
Yeah. So how many people are you dedicating to each team? How much money are you dedicating to each area? What, technological investments, right? Because you still have sales, you still have marketing, you still have ops, you have product, but dialing each of those up and down based on their impact or engagement with the customers, based on the buyer journey for your customers, right? Kind of matching those up.
That's exactly right. And if you look at it, it's hard. It's not hard to do if you can separate, but really look at the ROI of each of those touch points as well, right? Obviously, a customer service organization may be a loss for you, but are you getting as much return based on that, helping the other areas of the business? And I think we tend to look at it exclusively on the sales end, and then maybe on the client services or customer success, we look at the churn numbers, but really look at your investment in each of those areas. And the other thing I would caution, I'll use that 95% reoccurring revenue. Well, if they wanted to expand that business, right, they're going to have to look at the upfront, right, the demand generation resources to go get new clients. And that engine, the way they're currently going to market, is not built to support onboarding new clients. So this one definitely gets more complicated. But I think if you take a step back and just think of it from like the CEO level, right? I've got all these dollars to spend against these customers. Where are my best investments? And I think this is more relevant as you're starting to scale your business. So from $1 million to 10 million, where am I going to have to place these bets? But then if you look at the much larger company, do I have the assets where they need to be? Has my business changed enough that, I just keep funding the same groups over and over and over? So I think it's just taking a new look and, aligning it back to the eye, right? What is your customer telling you?
Right. Yeah. Continually looking for those insights. I love it. So the rounding out the four, we've got insight, story, engagement, and now we've got T for talent, your talent strategy. Tell us a little bit about what you see folks doing effectively here, Brett.
Yeah, I think this really comes down to making sure you got the right people in the right roles. A lot of the times I'll work with companies and say, yeah, we've got 50 sales reps. Well, I actually dig in, and they're really just account managers, right? Making sure that they're getting the customer to sign up year after year, but their comp plans are based on what I would call a traditional sales plan. So it's not only having the right skill set, as if we go to the traditional sales hunter model, is definitely one mindset and one skill set, where somebody that's working with the customer to make sure they're leveraging the product and they're satisfied should also be a very different skill set. So it's just making sure you get the right people in the right roles, and also the right compensation, that's going to tie back to what you're doing with the engagement model. I want to say companies, this is an afterthought sometimes, but I think maybe not in sales, because there's definitely a lot of focus on sales and compensation. But if you go back to the engagement model, I would argue you should take a fresh look at, how you're actually compensating people and what those goals and KPIs are. And then this can also get into, the culture and development as, more and more millennials are entering the workforce. What they're looking for is different than maybe what, again, I'll throw the traditional 15 to 20-year-old manufacturing B2B company, is probably built differently. So this is, again, making sure the people are a part of it. And I'm not saying, the I, S, or E, or T is more important, but if you don't get, the story right and the engagement model right, your talent strategy is not going to be as effective. So it's really, like I said, building off of each of the areas.
Yeah. I love this perspective on it. And I definitely see this as a framework that, like you said, could be applied in a lot of different areas, whether you're, a more mature B2B company looking to, scale up after you've hit a plateau of growth, or, you're a growing company in the middle of growth, things to be thinking about for now and for in the future. Brett, this has been a great conversation, man. If anybody listening to this would like to reach out to you, ask some follow-up questions on this ISET methodology, or just stay connected with you, what's the best way for them to go about doing that, man?
I think the best way is through LinkedIn. And you can find me at Brett Trainor. That's BRETT TRAINOR. So 3 T's there in the middle at LinkedIn. I said I'm a principal at PointB. I think there's only one with my profile in there. And like I said, more than happy to have conversations and follow up with anybody that's interested in learning more. I'm passionate about this area of the B2B world. So like I said, I'm happy to engage with anyone.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate you sharing the lessons that you've learned and the new things that you're thinking about as you see, changes in the way that B2B companies go to market and align their resources for continued growth. So, Brett, thank you so much for being on the show today, man.
Hey, it was great. Thanks for having me, Logan. Have a great day.
You too.
There are lots of ways to build a community, and we've chosen to build the B2B growth community through this podcast. But because of the way podcasts work, it's really hard to engage with our listeners. And without engagement, it's tough to build a great community. So here's what we've decided to do. We're organizing small dinners across the country with our listeners and guests. No sales pitches, no agenda, just great conversations with like-minded people. We'll talk business, we'll talk family, we'll talk goals and dreams. We'll build friendships. So if you'd like to be a part of a B2B growth dinner in a city near you, go to b2bgrowthdinners.com. That's b2bgrowthdinners.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.